Okay, so get this right. Today we're diving into a story. It's about faith, identity, standing up for what you believe in, even when it means losing, well, everything.
Sounds intense.
It is. So the story's about this guy, Matthew LaBanca. He was a music teacher at a Catholic school, and get this, also the music director at his church.
Wow, so like fully immersed in the Catholic community.
Totally. And he loved it. Great with his students, super dedicated to both jobs from what we can tell anyway.
Okay, so what's the twist? There's got to be a twist, right?
Oh, there's a twist. All right. LaBanca is gay, and he ends up, he gets married to his husband.
Okay, yeah.
And boom, fired from both jobs. Just like that. World turned upside down.
Oh, wow. So we're talking about like LGBTQ plus discrimination within the Catholic school system.
Yeah.
The clash between personal beliefs and those institutional rules.
Exactly. And we're going to be looking at this play called Communion. It's based on LaBanca's experience.
Communion. Interesting title. Already loaded with meaning, don't you think?
For sure. And the play itself is fascinating. LaBanca actually wrote and performs it himself. It's a one-man show.
Wow. So he's like taking back his narrative, turning his pain into art.
Right. It's like he's inviting the audience into this incredibly vulnerable space, sharing his story directly.
Powerful. And how does he pull that off? I mean, logistically, how do you make a one-man show about this kind of experience work on stage?
Well, he uses some really creative staging techniques. Like at one point, he actually turns the audience into his church choir.
Oh, I get it. That blurring of lines between performer and observer. It forces the audience to like confront those complexities head on.
Exactly. And it plays beautifully into the whole theme of communion, right? That sense of shared faith and community that he's ultimately excluded from.
Right, right. Despite being so deeply involved. And I bet the play doesn't shy away from the emotions, does it?
Not at all. It takes you through the whole roller coaster. From that initial joy he felt in his teaching, his music, to the devastation of getting that phone call, being told he could be dismissed.
Oof, I can't even imagine. Just waiting for that other shoe to drop.
And he had to wait like 6 weeks for the official word.
Seriously. Man, that's rough. It's like they have all the power in that situation.
And that's where the legal stuff gets interesting. Catholic schools, they can actually fire employees who they consider ministers of the faith.
Ministers of the faith. I feel like that could be a pretty broad term.
Totally. And it has been challenged in court, actually. It's a bit of a gray area.
So how does that play into LaBanca's situation specifically?
Well, he argued that he wasn't ordained, didn't teach religion, just music. So why should he be held to that standard?
Right, right. So it becomes a question of, like, who gets to define minister of the faith? What are the boundaries there?
Absolutely. And there's this one part in the play, it's with the Monsignor. He basically dismisses Pope Francis's more accepting words about LGBTQ plus individuals, calls them just opinion, not church teaching.
Interesting. So it's like even within the church, there's this tension between different interpretations, different viewpoints.
It's a lot more complex than just a simple right or wrong, black or white situation.
Right. Like layers upon layers of nuance,
Yeah, and navigating all of that must have been incredibly difficult for LaBanca, especially when he thought living in New York City would somehow shield him from this kind of discrimination.
Oh, yeah, because New York is, it's New York. It's supposed to be this bastion of progressive values.
Right. And yet, here he is, facing this incredibly difficult situation. It makes you wonder what's happening in other parts of the country where maybe those protections aren't as strong.
Definitely makes you think, like, is this just the tip of the iceberg?
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so important. We're not just talking about one man's story. We're talking about a much bigger issue.
Right. We're talking about systems, about power, about how those things impact individual lives.
Okay, but back to LaBanca in the play. It doesn't hold back on his emotions, especially the anger and hurt towards the church. Like, there's a point where he straight up calls out their hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy? Like, how so?
He points to all these other Catholic teachings that, let's be honest, lots of people don't strictly follow.
Oh, I see. It's that rules for thee but not for me argument. Selective enforcement,
Exactly. And it's like he's asking, if you're going to hold me accountable for this specific teaching, shouldn't everyone be held to the same standard across the board?
It's a question of fairness and consistency, for sure.
Right. And it's interesting because even with all that anger and hurt, there's this glimmer of hope that runs through the whole play, turning his pain into art, offering free tickets to bishops to see it, refusing to be silenced.
It's like he hasn't given up on the possibility of, like, reconciliation or at least some kind of dialogue.
Exactly. And that's what makes his story so compelling. He's not just a victim, he's an activist, an artist. He's trying to use this experience to make a difference.
That takes a lot of courage, especially when you've been through something so painful.
Absolutely. And speaking of courage, remember that settlement he was offered?
Oh, yeah, the one where he'd get paid to stay quiet.
Yep. He refused it.
Wow, really? So he was willing to walk away from, like, financial compensation just to be able to speak his truth.
It shows how important this is to him. It's not about the money, it's about the principle.
Powerful. And by refusing to be silenced, he's keeping the conversation alive, you know.
It's like he's saying, this isn't just about me, this is about everyone who's ever felt marginalized, discriminated against by an institution they thought they could trust.
And it's so interesting that he still offered those free tickets to bishops, even after everything that happened.
Right. What do you think that says about him?
That's a good question. Maybe it shows he still believes in dialogue, in the possibility of change, even with those who have hurt him.
It's like he's saying, I want you to see my story, to understand my pain, and maybe, just maybe, we can find some common ground.
Powerful.
Yeah.
So even though he was excluded from that religious community, he's still reaching out for a different kind of communion.
A communion built on empathy and understanding.
Exactly. And that's a message we could all use a little more of these days, don't you think? Especially with all the division and polarization going on.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even when we disagree, we can still connect as human beings.
And those difficult conversations, the ones that challenge us, they can be the most important ones we ever have.
So LaBanca is now teaching music at a public school not far from his old jobs, and he's still sharing his story.
It's like he's come full circle in a way, but on his own terms.
And the article ends with this quote from him. You can't go wrong when you prioritize love.
Such a simple statement, but man, it's packed with meaning.
It really speaks to the core of his journey, doesn't it? Choosing love, even when it's hard.
Absolutely. And I think that's something we can all learn from, no matter what our beliefs or background.
So, LaBanca's story, as told in Communion, it's a testament to resilience, to finding meaning in pain, and to inspiring change through vulnerability and authenticity.
It's a story that'll stay with me, that's for sure. And I hope it resonates with our listeners as well.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, it's a story about hope.
Hope for a more inclusive and compassionate world. It's interesting how he brings in all these outside perspectives into the play, like he uses news footage and stuff to show how this wasn't just some isolated thing, you know?
Oh, yeah, like it was actually making waves out in the world beyond the church itself. Smart move.
Right. It became this whole societal issue about LGBTQ plus rights and discrimination. And it really hit home for me when they quoted this one audience member, David Harvey. He talked about spiritual violence, how the church was falling short of its own ethical standards.
Yeah, spiritual violence.
Yeah.
Wow, that's heavy.
It is. It really gets at that deep sense of betrayal, you know, like when the very community that's supposed to support you turns its back on you.
Yeah, it's like, where do you even go from there? Who do you turn to when the place you're supposed to find solace is the source of your pain?
Exactly. And remember how LaBanca thought that being in New York City would somehow make him immune to this? Like, this is New York, right? It's supposedly this super progressive place.
I know, right? It kind of shatters that illusion that certain places are just automatically safe havens.
It shows how this kind of discrimination can happen anywhere, even where you least expect it. Which makes you wonder what's going on in places where those progressive values aren't as strong.
Exactly. It makes you think this could be happening everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And it really shines a light on that power dynamic too, right? Between the individual and this massive institution.
Yeah, it feels like LaBanca was totally at their mercy. And the play itself gets pretty raw about his emotions. Like, he doesn't hold back the anger and hurt.
I can imagine. To have your whole world ripped apart like that, it's got to be tough to reconcile those feelings with your faith.
And there's this point where he calls out the church's hypocrisy, right? He points to all these other teachings that people don't necessarily follow to the letter.
Right, right. Like, it's okay to bend the rules sometimes, but not when it comes to this particular issue.
It feels like he's saying, if you're going to hold me to this standard, shouldn't everyone be held accountable for everything?
Yeah, that whole rules for thee but not for me mentality, it definitely creates a sense of unfairness.
For sure. But here's the thing. Even with all that anger and hurt, there's still this thread of hope running through it all. He turns his pain into art, offers those tickets to the bishops, refuses to be silenced.
It's like he's fighting back, but in a really constructive way, you know?
Yeah.
He's not just letting this experience crush him.
He's using it to spark a conversation, to maybe even create some change. And that brings us back to that settlement he was offered.
Oh, yeah, the hush money. I was wondering when we get back to that.
So they offered him this settlement, right? But it came with a condition.
Let me guess. He had to stay silent about everything.
Bingo! And you know what he did? He turned it down.
Whoa, seriously? He walked away from all that money. That's a powerful statement.
It shows how deeply he believes in speaking his truth, even if it costs him financially.
Yeah, he's not backing down. He's standing firm in his convictions.
It makes you realize that sometimes the most important things in life aren't about money at all. It's about integrity, about fighting for what you believe in, even when it's hard.
And by refusing to be silenced, he's keeping that conversation going. It's not just about him anymore. It's about everyone who's ever felt marginalized or silenced by a powerful institution.
And offering those free tickets to the bishops, that was a bold move, even after everything they did to him. Why do you think he did that?
That's a really good question. I mean, could it be seen as an act of defiance? Like, I'm not afraid of you. I want you to see what you've done. But it could also be something more nuanced, right?
Yeah, like maybe a genuine desire for understanding, a hope that they might see his perspective, feel some empathy.
Right, because at the end of the day, even though he's been hurt, it seems like he still believes in the power of dialogue.
It's almost like he's saying, come see my story, come try to understand my pain, and maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to move forward together. It's like he's still holding out hope for some kind of reconciliation,
Yeah.
even after everything.
Yeah. It's like maybe he hasn't completely given up on the church. Or maybe he's just trying to understand it better, to make sense of what happened.
Maybe it's a bit of both. And it makes me think about how we approach those tough conversations, the ones that challenge our beliefs, our values.
Yeah, like those moments where you have to decide, am I going to shut down and protect my own perspective? Or am I going to actually try to listen, to understand where the other person is coming from?
It's not easy, that's for sure. But maybe it's in those moments of discomfort, of really listening to each other, that we can actually start to bridge those divides.
I think you're right. Because if we just stay in our own echo chambers, we're never going to grow, we're never going to learn anything new.
Exactly. So where is LaBanca now? Well, the article says he's teaching music again.
Still teaching music.
Yeah.
After all that.
Yep. But at a public school this time. Not too far from his old jobs, actually.
Interesting. So he's kind of going back to his roots, but in a different setting.
Right. It's like he's found a new space where he can be himself authentically without fear of judgment.
And he can keep sharing his story, keep making music. That's got to be empowering.
I think so. And the article ends with this great quote from him. You can't go wrong when you prioritize love.
Man, that's deep.
Right. It's like the simple truth that he's learned through all of this.
It's about choosing love, even when it's hard, even when it's messy.
And LaBanca's story, it's a perfect example of that. It's about resilience, about finding meaning in the midst of pain, and about inspiring change through vulnerability.
Yeah. It's a story that I think a lot of people can relate to, whether they've experienced something similar or not. Because at its core, it's about what it means to be human.
To make mistakes, to get hurt, to pick yourself back up, and to keep fighting for what you believe in.
And to never stop believing in the power of love.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into communion. It's a story that will stay with me, and I hope it's given you something to think about too.